Sure. So I'm a junior history major, and I'm also in the STEP program for teaching, and I'm also minoring in journalism. I decided on this, which is something I'm actually going to go into a little bit once I get into the presentation, why I decided to do this. But just basically, it brings together my interests of history and film together, and yeah.
Okay, what year are you in?
A junior.
Junior. You may have said that. I'm sorry if I didn't hear it. Okay, terrific. Go right ahead.
All right. So, the presentation titled Frank Capra, the Great Depression and the Fallacy of the American Dream. So, some people might not know who Frank Capra is. I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But Great Depression and the Fallacy of the American Dream kind of speaks for itself, and we'll see how those connect together. So, I'm going to start with a preliminary timeline of the United States. So, in 1929, the U.S. falls into the Great Depression and worsens in the few years that come after. And by 1933, already over 25% of Americans are unemployed. And in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president at the time, he established New Deal initiative. So this was not only to help progress the country and aid them at a time where there was a crisis financially and socially. It was also to help in the years following, so looking very forward into the future. So things that came out of the New Deal include the Emergency Banking Act, which helped to restore public confidence in the nation's financial system, and this sort of encapsulates a lot of what was going on in the country in terms of people's view of the government and financial institutions. So there was a lot of trust that was being lost in the government and the banks at this time. And in 1935, the Revenue Act was introduced, and this introduced a wealth tax. We keep going to 1940, there are more things that go on economically, such as the Revenue Act in 1942, and Roosevelt is still president. The U.S. is in the war at this time. And by 1945, when World War II ends, there was still some post-war initiatives that come out of that, such as the Employment Act of 1946. And this was to help the country know what is going on economically. It's has the federal government inform the people of what is going on, so everyone is more informed of the country's status. So the question that I want everyone to think about is, since capitalism is at risk of failing during the Depression, and President Roosevelt wants to heal this with his New Deal, how do the films that we're going to discuss meet the needs of Americans at the time in regard to their values? So this changing cultural and political landscape in America, again, it comes out of the Great Depression, and Roosevelt plays a big part in how the country views the nation on a federal level, but also how people interact socially. And Frank Capra, he plays a big part in terms of media, in how the views of the people, and how the people view the country, how that is expressed through film. So Frank Capra, he's an immigrant. He immigrated from Italy to Los Angeles in the early 1900s. And he started making films in the 1920s, and he continued and became more prominent into the 1930s and 40s. There's one book that I want to mention, which is sort of a shout out to the history department. Since last April, I went on a bookstore trip to the East Village, to East Village Books, and I picked up this book, which is called The American Dream in the Great Depression. It's by historian Charles R. Hearn. And in this, he criticizes a rose-colored view of the American dream. And this is sort of related to what we're going to be talking about with Capra's films and how that reflects that same idea. So I'm going to read this whole thing because I think it's very important to mention. So Hearn writes, in the 30s, a different kind of emphasis was required by the fact that American capitalism seemed incapable of satisfying even the nation's physical needs, much less the spiritual needs. The crucial problem was no longer that the American dream had become materialistic and corrupting, but that the promises of the American dream had been so utterly broken as to cast millions into poverty and desperation. Hearn mentions some literature from this time as well, from the early 20th century, such as Of Mice and Men and The Great Gatsby, both of which are not very optimistic films. They are focusing on the very brutal parts, sort of the ugly parts of America in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. Of Mice and Men and The Great Gatsby are both high school staples at this point. Probably most people have read it. And they do not, especially Of Mice and Men, does not exactly end very well, right? So they're not very afraid to focus on these ugly aspects of American history. So to get back to Capra, some films of his are up there. And two that we're going to be focusing on, briefly we're going to talk about Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and the main focus is going to be on It's a Wonderful Life. So how many people in this room have seen It's a Wonderful Life? Yeah? So It's a Wonderful Life, that has become a Christmas staple at this point. It is a Christmas classic that a lot of people watch on Christmas. Some interesting history behind that is that it was not very popular when it came out. It completely failed at the box office. And there was also some problems in terms of how it represented the banking class and people who were very wealthy. So some places wanted to ban it. And it began being broadcast on TV because it was very, like I said, it was a failure at the box office. So the studio didn't care about the copyright rights for it. So many broadcast companies were able to broadcast it freely. And Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, this was from 1939, It's a Wonderful Life is from 1946. So 7 years earlier, he made Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And both of these are starring Jimmy Stewart, and he's sort of this person of very huge optimism in these films. So to start with Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Jimmy Stewart plays a man, Mr. Smith, the title Mr. Smith, and he is a fish out of water who ends up becoming a member of Congress, and he does a job that was on par and even better than some of the other people who were already established politicians. And what the film really shows is how someone even who may not be extremely politically well-versed, they're still able to know the values of the people at the time. And with It's a Wonderful Life, you can see Jimmy Stewart right there in the middle. He plays a character named George Bailey. To the left is his wife, and to the right is his daughter, who he's holding. This is towards the end of the film. So when we talk about the timeline of It's a Wonderful Life, in 1919, George Bailey, he's 12 years old, and he rescues his brother from drowning. And then it moves forward in 1928, and George is planning a world tour before college, where he has to stay behind to take over for his father, who suddenly dies, and take over the banking company that his family owns, the loan and banking company. And in late 1945, this is where the big climax of the film is. This is where most of the conflict takes place, where George Bailey, he starts to contemplate suicide, and he feels that he's resenting all the sacrifices that he's made at this time with the banking company that begins to fail, since him and his wife had to personally fund to keep the bank going, since a lot of people were withdrawing their money from the bank. So again, even with this, relating to back to before, there's that loss of trust that goes on, and it's represented in the film as well. So as George contemplates suicide, a guardian angel comes back down. This is where it starts to get a little bit supernatural, but it still works and feels very grounded in a way. George is contemplating suicide, and his guardian angel comes to save him and shows him that life is worth living, and that life without him would be sort of a bizarro world called Pottersville in the film. So Bedford Falls is where they live, but the bizarro version is called Pottersville, and this is after the man Henry Potter, who was sort of the villain of the film. He was that wealthy, corrupt man who was in charge of a bank. And the townspeople at the end, they end up donating money to keep the bank alive after George Bailey is shown that life is worth living and that the people around him have been positively affected by it. So as Roger Ebert, who's one of the most famous film critics, what he wrote in 1999 was that Capra wanted the film to be special, wanted to be a celebration of lives and dreams of America's ordinary citizens. Now, when you look at It's a Wonderful Life, the title may be a little bit misleading in some ways, since It's a Wonderful Life, right, it's a very optimistic title, but I see it as very ironic in a lot of ways, because if you ever watch the film, you're not thinking that it's extremely optimistic the whole time, right? There's a lot of conflicts that George Bailey goes through the entire time, especially at the end of the film, and to say that It's a Wonderful Life seems like before, like how Hearn wrote, that it's a rose-colored view of the American dream. And I think that Capra, being an immigrant coming over and seeing the American dream firsthand and making his way in America, and being in the service as well. He was a major during World War II. He also served in World War I. Having that background, I think he was able to see a more real side of Americans, especially the ugly parts when he was there in the service overseas. So I want to return to our question. which is, do the films we discuss meet the needs of Americans at the time in regard to their values?
Mm-hmm.
So does anybody have any ideas? I want to share anything related to that?
Well, what I'm kind of interested in is, you're a student in history. What do you hope to do after you finish Adelphi?
Well, I want to go into the teaching field, and I want to hopefully get my master's in. Well, I'm going to get my master's in education, but if needed, I'll get my history master's, and then possibly go over to a PhD program following that.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I just have a thought about your question. When it comes to investing in the stock market, it's always faith in something that, faith in the country, no matter what. And I think that that comes through in both films, that faith is part of capitalism. I know that it may sound general, but I don't know. So I think that people in the United States, I just thought of it as you were speaking, that we place an emphasis on being able to have faith so that the economy can continue. Faith in depositing money in the bank, faith in that companies are going to survive even if they have downturns. So I think these films are about faith. That's an important value, I think. Is that a value?
Absolutely, yeah.
Is that a value?
Yep.
Well, I wonder how, I'm not used to having history students ask me questions. So I'm gonna turn this around and ask it back at you, but, at the time, I think that these films are about, as you say, it's a breakdown in faith or trust or credit, of American institutions, but not faith in America itself, right? That there's small town virtues and face-to-face communities, this metaphor for the nation and the economy as a whole. And certainly in It's a Wonderful Life, it literally ends with the community saving itself in this important way. But when, in meeting the needs of Americans at the time, but what about today, right? Where we, after the 2008 financial crash and the COVID, do we feel that this is a purely naive view that somehow faith in America and the existence of something called communities can save us from the excesses of capitalism in the same way?
Well, yeah, I think that's a great point to bring up, because especially back then, I think in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, a lot of the films that were made were a reflection of the way people were thinking at the time. And not only the content of the films themselves, but also what was going on behind the scenes, what inspired the filmmakers to show what they were showing on screen. And now, if you're talking about more modern day, there definitely are a lot of select films that you can choose that do sort of reflect that idea of loss and trust in some ways, but I feel like it doesn't relate as much to a bigger picture of like a bigger crisis in the country or in the world, unless it's very overt. Not many films, I think, at least in the past 30 years, have been very subtle about what they're trying to say in terms of a big crisis. It sort of is like a storytelling of either like from the 90s, if it's like Bush, like the film Vice, is just very just straightforward. It's about this. I feel like with older films, it's easier to find yourself in the film as opposed to films nowadays where you're looking sort of like a textbook, but on the screen. Yeah.
Well, you certainly have a history professor here. I'm sorry, I don't know who you are.
I'm Michael Lacombe, I'm in the history department.
Yeah, I mentioned that I'm in the business school, but we've never met. But the reason I asked the question I asked at the beginning is, it seems to me that he needs to decide whether he's studying the ideology of films or whether he's studying history. And those are two different things. I hope you understand that. And there's a certain reality of history It's not just interpretation. And so you have to decide what it is actually that you're studying. Are you studying the ideology of film, or are you studying the history of the United States?
I guess, in my mind at least, it's a meshing of both, but if it comes to choosing one side or the other, I think I will land in history, but I like to bring in media and film and music.
Yeah, but you realize that film is not the history of the United States.
Well, yes. What I think I focus on the most is what inspires the filmmakers to make the films in the way that they do, as opposed to the content themselves.
Students over
Yeah,
here.
I mean, I think that it's important to look at, like, with, let's say in It's a Wonderful Life, that angel figure is kind of a savior, and that's probably what many Americans wanted to see at the time, is this savior with his, thank you, well, you know, coming to their aid in this really hard financial time. So I think understanding, you know, that symbolism, we have to look at the history behind it so we can really get what is happening.
This is our star history student.
Yeah, but the point being that A Wonderful Life is not the history of the United
I
States.
know it's not the history of the United States, but you need history to history can be an element to understand the film even further.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Okay, well, anyway, we need to move on to the next person. Bradley Dreisman.
All right, all right.
That was